Plausibility Illusion, a documentary. Virtual reality. I'm sure you heard of it by now. Maybe your uncle has a headset or you have a younger kid. Or maybe you've seen ads for the newest Meta Quest. Either way, cat's out of the bag. Virtual reality is mainstream. Although it seems like a new concept, the truth is it's actually been in development for years, even as far back as this day. I remember back when I was in film school creating a video on virtual reality in the 1980s. That was a late representation of it at the time. Whether it be from books, movies, etc., and so on forth, you've probably seen depictions of virtual reality in some form of way. For heaven's sake, even myself I went back to school to learn about it. I still remember the first time I came across the concept of virtual reality. I was around 15 or 16 years old, and Sword Art Online, an anime, was making its way around the internet. Me being a massive anime fan at the time, I decided to invest time into the show and give it a watch. Needless to say, I was pretty obsessed. Don't get me wrong, the parts of it that were bad were really bad, but I didn't care about that at the time. The only thing I cared about was the possibility of a future where you could manipulate your form to live in digital worlds. This was very fun for me to think about, especially because at the time I was into fantasy worlds, specifically video games. In some ways, I find it funny in retrospect that I moved from film to virtual reality interests, both being a form of escapism that I find fascinating, one being more specifically a temporary form of entertainment, and the other a longer form, you could say. Anyways, part of the reason why I speak on behalf of school and virtual reality is because the core idea and thing I want to talk about today stems from the future of virtual reality and something I learned about in school. About a year or two ago, I found out the specifics of a psychology experiment, one that essentially operated in a simple way, so let me spell it out for you. Essentially, in this experiment, a person sits in a chair and puts both of their hands on a desk. Then a contraption is placed that separates the person's one hand and is covered by cloth. Here's a photo of kind of what I'm talking about. Then a fake hand is placed in front of the user that hand operates as kind of like a demo hand. So in this instance, you can see a fake hand where your normal hand should be, and then suddenly a knife is jabbed into the fake hand. However, despite it being a fake hand, the person still recoils when the knife is jabbed into the hand. Although they don't experience pain, their reaction is enough to tell that a part of them kind of jolted from the experience, almost believing that the fake hand itself became their own hand. So this got me thinking one day, what if that experience could be recreated in virtual reality? We know that in virtual reality, everything we see is from our perspective in a first-person view. So I kind of thought, like, what would the experience be like if a knife was jolted into the hand of a person in, like, let's say, a horror VR game? Would they flinch in a similar method? Research then told me that yes, this is the case. But let's take a step back quickly and talk about perspective, especially from the viewpoint of VR. So perspective in games and media tend to come from different viewpoints. When you sit down and watch a movie, you are looking at it from a shot perspective. You see the shot, and then they come from the first-hand perspective of the filmmaker. In games, however, it's a little different. Games have a multitude of perspectives. Some of them you might be familiar with. These perspectives include third-person perspective, first-person perspective, which sometimes I like to call first-person shooter perspective, or FPS for short, for those styles of games you see at times, just because a lot of them are first-person shooters. There's also a top-down perspective or a bird's-eye perspective. This is my personal favorite type of perspective. Don't ask me why. I think it just has something to do with seeing everything possible. Anyways, with first-person perspective, you commonly can't see your hands. It's usually in front of yourself, but there are instances where you can. Especially like in the FPS genre, or you can see the gun. Usually you'll just see the gun though. You won't necessarily always see the hands attached to the gun, but there are some cases where that will be the case. In this instance though, when your hand is stabbed in first person on a monitor, it likely won't cause you to flinch, but in an immersive VR environment, it commonly would. Plus, we would have to take into account that VR technology is still in its infancy. This means that if people are flinching now when the technology is barely as immersive as we want it to be, well then I'd assume in the far off future the element of that could have a massive impact. So, why am I talking about this? Well, it was this idea coupled with the concept of horror and pain through VR that became an idea I researched in a paper. I wanted to know the extent of how this experiment would interact with virtual reality. In this case, I began to write a semi-psychology based paper, which is kind of ironic because I'm in a program called New Media, which was something I wasn't expecting to do, but I had a lot of fun doing it. In this instance with my paper, I learned about two concepts a little more niche: the idea of plausibility illusion and VIST. Now, these terms are rather new from my research as they have barely been talked about, but the plausibility illusion aspect presents itself as a method in which you are in a VR space and feel fear. That sense of fear is still real, whereas this type of illusion states that you are aware that you are aware of what you are seeing, yet you still feel fear. It is these states of presence that interact with VR and fear and pain in an interesting manner. Of course, maybe in the future we can advance VR to a level where you do feel pain, but then what differentiates our virtual world from our real world? Food? Maybe yes, but the nervous system feeling of food being eaten, I'm sure can still probably be recreated in the far off future. So it was this essay that prompted me to create this video, a combination between a psychology experiment, virtual reality, fear, pain, and horror. I ended the essay off speaking on behalf of the idea of simulated pain, something grotesque in nature, potentially real in the future. Although these topics remain grim, I still want to speak about them and really analyze the idea of fear and pain responses in virtual reality, not just because I am a horror aficionado and I've spent most of my life creating horror films, but because the idea is something that isn't really talked about much and I want to bring it more to light to be. But what happens when we simulate pain in a VR experience meant to torture a human being? Can we lock them away in a virtual world and simulate a form of torture that would overdo a real sense feeling of torture that you can experience in real life? These are the types of questions I'm kind of curious about. What if you could do some weird, like Sharingan kind of Naruto thing in the future and take off the limits of time and aging in VR and simulate pain for external amounts of time? I joke here kind of with the Sharingan reference as a pain vortex. This is something that the character Itachi from Naruto could use and put people into. In this instance, it was Itachi who stabbed the ninja Kakashi multiple times through his genjutsu illusion magic. So, what if you could do that in real life? How would that impact our world in the future of pain? So I kind of want to talk about virtual reality and horror for a little bit here. As a horror enthusiast, I found that a lot of talk revolving horror in recent years has been at times focused on VR. Even recently, the best VR game of the year was awarded to the game The Midnight Walk, which happened to be a horror game. There is a correlation between horror and VR as senses are heightened, and that roller coaster feeling of motion you get when you watch a horror movie is further elevated in a space where you can see everything from all angles. However, horror is meant to be fun as a genre. It simulates that feeling of a roller coaster, but its intention isn't to damage a person's health. It's more so to delve into creativity and look at darker aspects of our world. I don't love horror as I love how it affects people in a negative way. I love the joy that horror brings to people. However, I do draw the line on damage with regards to horror and virtual reality. Of course, similarly so, I also draw the line on any form of torture. This leads me to believe that if simulated horror can create a sense of unease that overweighs a sense of entertainment, well, then I guess it will do damage to a user in that case. Sure, label me as I am, someone who can see practically most anything. I'm obsessed with the concept of fear. I've seen the Terrifier movies and so on forth, but I'm not as messed up as you might think I am. I live in a better world, but I don't think pain should be something we should follow. I believe in the entertainment value of horror and the aspects of horror that couple themselves with theater and Halloween, but I do think the future would be incredibly bleak if horror was used as a simulated method to bring people pain. For example, my mom hates horror, and this is understandably so. I would never push my liking of horror onto someone who struggles with it as is. But imagine if you could. What if someone could put someone in a virtual world and force them to witness horror? The idea of it is incredibly scary. Simulated horror being a weaponized mechanic for businesses or debt. You can imagine the possibilities. Anyways, thank you for listening to my mini TED Talk. I'm curious as to the future of virtual reality, and I know other people might have the same concerns I have. I just haven't seen much research done in this specific area, so I thought it would be interesting to deep dive into it. So thank you, and have a good day.